Okay, this is part 3 of my video series looking at Russ Miller's Facts versus Darwin from Carl Baugh's Creation in the 21st Century television program. I'll get started.
Is absolute fraud, and the evolutionary community knows it.
Absolutely.
The late Stephen Jay Gould said this should have been removed long ago, and yet he didn't try to get it removed.
They actually knew in the 1800s that this was a fraud. Yet here's a new textbook, and this is a takeoff of the theory of recapitulation. It shows what they say is a human in the embryonic stage next to a chicken in the embryonic stage, looking almost identical, and they say we have gill slits from our days where we were in our fish phase. But these aren't gill slits, they're not gills of any sort, they're simply folds in the skin that later develop into the organs in the throat and neck area.
That's correct.
So this is total fraud.
Okay, now that clip that I just showed, it has so many outright lies in it that it's unbelievable. I can't for a second believe that he was saying all of those things with a straight face and legitimately believing them. He has to know how many lies. He was just spewing outright fraud, lies in that. I'm talking about fraud. Making stuff up. Apparently it's okay to lie for Jesus, right? That's okay. It's acceptable. Okay, let's see. Let's get started. First of all, this idea, again, I'm going to repeat. I am going to repeat this repeatedly. Recapitulation. The theory of recapitulation, that every single organism goes through its evolutionary history prior to being born, is an outdated theory that was tossed out over 100 years ago. Okay? Embryology is the study of embryos and their development and embryological homology and stuff like that, looking at comparing embryos of cross taxa, looking at their evolutionary history to determine their evolutionary history, is not the same as recapitulation. They're very different concepts. They both involve embryos. They both involve evolution, but they're not the same idea. No scientist today believes that things go through their evolutionary history. We do know that there are what would be called phylotypic phases, that there are particular structures that develop in common with related organisms. We do know that the closer things are, the closer their embryological development tends to match up with. So you absolutely could not tell a developing chimpanzee embryo from a developing human embryo until very, very late in development, when those final features start showing up, the certain characteristics start appearing. For example, because they're very closely related species, it's a lot easier to tell a human embryo from a fish embryo, although at early phases it's very difficult to tell those apart. I took a class called developmental biology, and part of one of our lab practicum, we had actually had to identify, I think it was like 15 different embryos. We had to identify them to taxon, rough taxon, based on a bunch of characteristics that we had learned. We were given the age, and we had to look at them and figure out what they were. It was extremely difficult with some of these to tell them apart. You simply cannot tell. They do look alike. That's this idea that somehow Haeckel fraud reusing a block print for 3 different species, which was wrong, somehow invalidates the entire science of embryology is a bunch of bullshit. It's just a bunch of bullshit, okay? And bringing up a textbook that has a picture of an embryo in it and going, see, look, the fraud's still here, is a lie. All right. He brought up Stephen Jay Gould wrote about this. Yes, indeed. Stephen Jay Gould wrote several essays on Haeckel. He has a book called Ontogeny and Phylogeny, but he specifically wrote several essays about Haeckel's frauds. And he talked about this is where he is lying. Russ Miller is outright lying about it because, first of all, Gould wrote a book about it, and they say he didn't even try to get it stopped. He wrote a book about why it's a terrible idea to keep including Haeckel's embryo drawings in textbooks. Okay, somehow that's not, I don't know where you get off saying that he somehow he knew it was wrong, but he was secretly supporting it because it furthered the case of evolution or something. That's what you're trying to imply. That's a bunch of bullshit. Gould was talking about using those embryo drawings, not the fraudulent ones. He's talking about using the legitimate ones because they've significantly been improved upon in the last 100 plus years, okay? We've got much, much better drawings. We've got much, much more accurate drawings. Remember, Haeckel did fudge a little bit. Maybe not purposefully, maybe purposely. It's really hard to tell because remember, we're talking about 19th century here. We did not have the tools we have today. But either way, the point is that since that time, during his lifetime, better drawings were produced, better prints were made. Now we have photographs, phenomenal photographs of all of these things. Gould was writing about textbook writers tending to reuse copyright-free material because it's free, rather than paying for quality material. That's what he was talking about wanting removed from the textbooks, not Haeckel, because Haeckel's drawings are all frauds. He was talking about using that series, and it's reprinted everywhere. That series I showed in video, last video, those are reused. Textbook authors, publishers tend to go as cheap as possible. They tend to increase their profit margins to the maximum they can, and if that involves taking a crappy photograph or a crappy drawing rather than a good one because the crappy one's free, they often tend to do that. That's what Gould was talking about. And if you had read that, if they had read that before talking about it, they would know it. They may not have read that because that same lie is perpetuated all over the place in creationist websites and creationist sources. They make that same claim. It's bullshit. Read the original papers by Gould. Read them. All right, and I guess I'm going to stop and go on here because I could rant about this for hours. Oh yeah, one more thing about the gill slits in the embryo. Russ Miller shows the textbook with it, saying that they're still perpetuating Haeckel's fraud today, claiming that there's gill slits, which means a fish phase and all of that crap. That's simply false. First of all chordates have gill slits. I don't like the term myself. I don't like it only because of the fact that the term pharyngeal pouches is a much better term. But a synonym of pharyngeal pouches, gill slits, works. Everybody understands what that means. They're not functioning gills. Nobody ever claims that humans have a fish-like functioning gills. We do have pharyngeal pouches. Chordates and near chordate types, deuterostomes like hemichordates and such, all have the same structure. They develop. The reason I don't like to call them gill slits personally is because they're not originally gills. They're actually, in primitive chordates, they're a feeding structure that then evolved into gills in the fishes, and then subsequently evolved into a whole bunch of things in the human face and neck and jaw and such, ear bones, all of that from these pharyngeal pouches. But ancestrally, they're not gills. Ancestrally, they're a filtration system, like in sea squirts and stuff. Use the pharyngea. The pharyngeal pouches are part of their filtering cephalochordates and such do. So that bothers me. But anyway, just the whole point. He's outright lying about the content of what that textbook is saying. So.
They oftentimes show students drawings of a whale's flipper or a cat's forelimb or the foreleg of a horse or a human forelimb, and they say we all have two bones in the forelimb, and so they claim this unity of plan is evidence of a common ancestor. Well, I guess you could claim that, but couldn't we equally say that's proof that we have the same intelligent designer?
Absolutely, plus the same purpose of getting around in mobility.
Yes, this is the old homology indicates a common designer rather than common ancestry argument. There's a couple of big flaws with that. He shows a whale flipper, for example, and compares it to other tetrapod limb bones and, discusses it. A whale flipper. Now, if you've ever seen a whale's flipper, right, you know it's a solid fin-like structure. Why would the designer put finger bones, all 5 fingers, inside it, not fused together, but fused within a solid mat of muscle and tendon, so that they're not movable? They can no longer function as fingers. Why would this designer be so attracted to that design that he would create fingers that can't function as fingers in any capacity? Why not make it like a fish's fin? Why not make it a solid or raise like a fish's fin? Why put those separate fingers in there? Why leave on a whale's flipper the stamp of its mammal tetrapod ancestry? For that matter, why would a whale have to breathe air? Why would a whale have to produce milk for its babies? Fish don't do that. In fact, no other sea life except for whales and dolphins and the other sea mammals produce milk. Why wouldn't a whale, if God was designing these things, right? He can design it to make it optimal. Why would he put these constraints on it, these constraints from a terrestrial existence, on something that he's putting in the ocean? That is why homology shows common ancestry and not a common design.
Well, Charles Darwin made an incredible admission.
He did. He stated that if his theory were true, numberless intermediate varieties must assuredly have existed. He thought the fossil record would be full of millions and millions of kinds slowly evolving into the other kind. And I must agree, if his theory is true, we should find millions of examples in the fossil record.
Now,
Again, pretty deceptive. First of all, that quote of Darwin's it's like a lot of the quotes that these creationists like to use. Darwin posed his questions in his book as, here's a problem with my theory, and then he spends the next chapter or so explaining why it's not really a problem. In other words, he's voicing the objections that might be raised, one of them being, if the theory is true, there certainly must be lots and lots of intermediate forms. Where are they? And then he goes on to explain why fossilization is rare. The fossil record is far from completely explored at his time, and even still far from explored today. All different kinds of things. Now we have other things that Darwin didn't know about via the science of genetics. We know a lot of other things about what we would expect to see. He wasn't saying like what Miller is trying to do here is make it sound like, Darwin admitted this thing about there being, there should be millions of intermediate fossils, and suddenly we don't find millions of intermediate fossils, so therefore his theory is false. That's not what that's saying. It's just it really bothers me when they word it like that. And the other thing is that specifically Darwin was talking about what you guys would call, what the creationists would call, change within kinds anyways. That chapter is on between, say, if all canines have a common ancestor, dogs, wolves, foxes, that we should see in the relatively recent fossil record, all of these gradations in between the actual related forms. He wasn't talking about between reptile and bird, or reptile and mammal, or fish and tetrapod. In that he was really discussing the changes within when speciation occurs. There should be all of the gradients in between, and instead we see species demarcated. That's what he was talking about there. So that's just it's borrowed from other sources, but yeah, that is pretty bad.
But if we go to the textbooks, kids are shown these evolutionary trees of life. And at the base, they claim to have a common invertebrate ancestor. But notice how they don't show what that ancestor was, just the word common ancestor. And then, Dr. Baugh, they show these colorful lines connecting everything on Earth.
You're good at making drawings.
To this supposed ancestor. But in real science, based on observation of evidence, each of these lines should be backed by millions of fossils of one kind slowly changing into another kind.
That tree that you show, the tree that he shows, that tree isn't based on fossils. That tree is based on molecular phylogeny. If we didn't have a single fossil of anything known, the DNA of the species, genetic analysis of these things, molecular analysis of other non-DNA proteins and such. Those are used to create those phylogenies. They happen to fit the fossils dead on, almost 100% accurate. Okay, and in fact, where they're inaccurate, we usually look and find that we've misunderstood some of the fossils. But the point is that those trees are used like that. They're not. We don't put these phylogenies together based on the fossils, because fossilization is an extremely rare event. We're only getting snapshots here and there scattered around. We have a lot. We have thousands of intermediates, even with that. But we don't have these millions that you discussed, and they wouldn't matter if we had none. We still have the phylogeny. Okay, I'm going to go on to part 4.